Imagine a man trusted with life and death, a healer whose hands were meant to save, not destroy. In the gilded halls of royalty, where every breath is scrutinized and every illness a threat to power, one physician turned medicine into a deadly game. Patients vanished, treatments became traps, and those who relied on his expertise were mere pawns in a sinister experiment. No one suspected the smiling doctor standing by the bedside, the one who whispered comfort while secretly plotting demise. Secrets, lies, and poison flowed through the corridors of the palace, leaving terror and suspicion in their wake. This is the chilling story of the royal physician who killed patients for fun. In the heart of a kingdom steeped in opulence and secrecy, the palace was both a sanctuary and a prison. Here, power was absolute, and life could hang on the skill of a single healer. Among the many who walked the marble halls, none commanded trust like the royal physician, a man whose knowledge of the human body made him indispensable to kings and queens alike. To the court, he was a savior, a man who could prolong life and mend ailments that others deemed incurable. Yet beneath the veneer of care and expertise, a darkness festered, hidden behind a smile and a white coat as immaculate as the marble floors he strode across. From the beginning, the physician's rise seemed almost predestined. A prodigy in anatomy and chemistry, he dazzled his mentors with his brilliance. He could diagnose with uncanny precision, treat with techniques no one else dared attempt, and predict the progression of disease as if he were glimpsing the future itself. Nobles whispered that his hands were blessed, that he was touched by some divine intelligence. When the king fell gravely ill during a winter plagued by fevers and epidemics, it was this physician who saved him, or so the court believed. His reputation became a crown in itself, one of knowledge, skill, and prestige. But brilliance, when combined with ambition and a warped sense of curiosity, can twist into something terrifying. The physician's fascination with human life evolved into an obsession with death. He began to view the patients entrusted to him not as people, but as experiments. Each illness a puzzle to manipulate, each treatment an opportunity to explore the limits of mortality. No one suspected that the man who soothed a queen's cough or a prince's fever was simultaneously calculating doses that could induce pain, fear, and ultimately death. The palace had unknowingly welcomed a predator in the guise of a healer. The first deaths were subtle, almost imperceptible. A noble with a weak constitution would suddenly succumb to an illness thought manageable. A child would fail to respond to medicine that had cured countless others. The physician's hand guided every action, every treatment, every prescription, yet the blame never fell on him. The court murmured of fragile health, unlucky circumstances, or unseen contagion. To the physician, these deaths were data points, tiny experiments to test poisons, reactions, and the resilience of the human body. Each success emboldened him, and each failure only deepened his obsession. What made him truly dangerous was his ability to mask intent behind charm and skill. To the king, he was loyal. To the queen, courteous. To the nobles, indispensable. He smiled in council chambers, offered polite advice at banquets, and moved through the corridors with the aura of benevolence. His victims never saw the danger coming, and his colleagues never suspected a thing. While others relied on rules, procedures, and medical ethics, he relied on intuition, cunning, and an unrelenting curiosity that bordered on madness. Soon, the physician began to experiment more openly, carefully selecting his victims. He chose those whose deaths would attract the least suspicion, whose absence would stir minimal grief. Yet he did not always follow caution. Sometimes he was motivated by curiosity, sometimes by petty resentment, and sometimes by a dark delight in seeing human frailty exposed in its rawest form. A servant who angered him would develop a mysterious ailment. A rival courtier would experience sudden weakness after his prescribed regimen. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. Though it was subtle enough that the court attributed it to misfortune rather than malice. The palace itself became his laboratory. Bedrooms, chambers, dining halls, and private gardens all offered opportunities for study. He observed reactions to food, medicine, and stress, noting every detail with meticulous precision. No symptom went unrecorded, no failure unexamined. He kept journals of ailments and deaths, detailing methods, timings, and effects with the care of a scientist and the detachment of someone who had forgotten compassion. These records, meant for his eyes alone, were the blueprint of a mind that had learned to separate life from morality. His methods were both innovative and horrifying. Some he treated with mixtures of rare herbs, others with toxic substances masked as medicine. A miscalculation in dosage could be fatal, but he learned quickly, refining his formulas, measuring reactions, and perfecting the art of invisible murder. What to others were tragedies became to him lessons, a terrifying calculus of life and death. As months turned into years, the physician's confidence grew. He could predict the progression of an illness almost to the hour, manipulate the body's responses, and create conditions in which survival or death were entirely within his control. The court, meanwhile, remained oblivious. Nobles praised his intellect, kings sought his counsel, and the royal family entrusted their lives to him without hesitation. Even when deaths mounted, the physician maintained an air of concern, grieving in public while calculating in private. He had perfected the ultimate illusion, the appearance of compassion masking the reality of malevolence. This duality fascinated him as much as it terrified him, feeding his ego and ensuring that his power within the palace remained unchallenged. Among those who began to suspect were minor servants and attendants, too low in status to confront him, but wise enough to note patterns. Whispers of "the healer who kills" circulated in hushed tones. Stories passed along quietly in kitchens and servant quarters. Yet these whispers never reached ears of true authority. Fear, hierarchy, and loyalty to the crown ensured that suspicion remained hidden, contained, and ineffective. And so the physician continued his experiments with impunity, each death reinforcing both his brilliance and his arrogance. His ambition was not merely scientific, it was personal. To him, control over life and death became a testament to power, a way to assert dominance over those who had once held sway over him. Nobles, doctors, and even the royal family became subjects of a grand experiment in obedience and vulnerability. He was a kingmaker and a reaper, operating in the shadows with meticulous precision. His successes fed an intoxicating sense of superiority, one that made him believe he was untouchable, omnipotent, and untethered from the moral laws that governed others. By the time the first decade of his reign as royal physician had passed, the palace had become both stage and laboratory. Lives were lost in silence, experiments conducted under the guise of care, and fear, though unacknowledged, began to permeate the halls. The physician's reputation was untarnished. He remained indispensable, admired and trusted. Yet the seeds of his eventual downfall were already sown. For every life he controlled, every death he orchestrated, he drew attention not through obvious misdeeds, but through patterns invisible to the naive eye. Patterns that, if discovered, would shock a kingdom to its core. The physician's story is one of brilliance corrupted by curiosity, intelligence twisted into cruelty, and trust transformed into terror. He rose in prominence by skill and maintained his position through deception, charm, and fear, masked as expertise. What began as a career in healing became an obsession with mastery over mortality itself, a dangerous game where every patient was a piece, every illness a variable, and every death a proof of power. And thus, the stage was set for what would become one of history's most chilling tales: the descent of a healer into a murderer, the rise of a man who wielded life and death as if they were merely tools for his amusement. The palace, once a place of trust and protection, had become a theater of terror, and the physician, unseen and unchallenged, was both director and executioner. With his position secure and his reputation untarnished, the royal physician's obsession evolved into something darker and more audacious. No longer content with subtle experiments, he began to manipulate illnesses with deliberate cruelty. Every patient became a canvas on which he could test the boundaries of human suffering. A fever that could have been treated gently was allowed to spike, pain prolonged for the sake of observation. The physician watched from his chambers, pen in hand, cataloging reactions, symptoms, and the slow deterioration of those under his care. Each reaction was noted with meticulous precision, each death a triumph in his perverse calculus. The palace itself transformed into an arena of terror. Courtiers whispered of mysterious illnesses that claimed the strongest and the weakest indiscriminately, of sudden collapses at banquets, and of children falling gravely ill overnight. Yet no one dared to confront the physician. He was untouchable. The king relied on him, the queen trusted him, and the nobility feared the consequences of challenging a man who could decide life or death with a single prescription. Fear was his ally, and he wielded it with masterful subtlety. What made his reign of terror even more insidious was the veneer of care he maintained. He comforted the grieving, offered gentle assurances, and was the first at a patient's bedside when symptoms worsened. The contrast between his outward compassion and hidden malice was his greatest weapon. By day, he was the trusted healer. By night, the meticulous executor of his own private experiments. Even those closest to him, fellow physicians, advisors, and servants, could not discern the pattern. His brilliance disguised malevolence in a way that no suspicion could penetrate. As his confidence grew, so did his audacity. He began targeting individuals whose deaths would shake the court, yet remain justifiable under the guise of medical misfortune. A rebellious minister with a sharp tongue, a noblewoman whose beauty threatened the queen's favor. Even distant envoys, all were vulnerable. He experimented with subtle toxins, rare herbs, and precise dosages, mastering the art of causing pain, while maintaining plausible deniability. The palace became a stage for his experiments, the court a gallery of his macabre artistry. But the physician did not act without reason. Each death, while cruel, was carefully calculated. He observed reactions not only in the patient, but in those around them, the subtle shifts in behavior, fear in the eyes of courtiers, the nervous gestures of servants. He delighted in the psychological impact of his actions, watching as panic, suspicion, and paranoia began to ripple through the palace. What had once been whispers in hidden corners became nervous glances, hushed conversations, and restless nights. His power was no longer only over life and death. It was over the very minds of those who served and ruled. Despite the growing unease, the physician remained untouchable, a shadow that could not be pinned down. His ability to manipulate appearances was nearly flawless. He would recommend treatments that appeared logical, administer tonics that seemed harmless, and smile reassuringly as patients withered under his care. Even when multiple deaths occurred in succession, the court attributed them to natural causes, fevers, or poor constitutions. The physician's reputation, far from faltering, seemed to flourish, cementing his influence in ways few could challenge. But no web, however intricate, remains unbroken forever. Subtle mistakes began to appear, unnoticed by the physician but slowly observed by those around him. A nurse recognized the same pattern of symptoms repeating in different patients. A servant noted the timing of poisons coinciding with his visits. A young apprentice began to question the logic of so many inexplicable deaths. While none dared speak out openly, the seeds of suspicion had been planted, and paranoia began to work against him. Even in his private chambers, he could no longer trust that his methods went unseen. As the body count rose, so did the physician's hubris. He believed himself invincible, untouchable, and omniscient. He extended his experiments, testing the limits of toxins, manipulating chronic illnesses, and observing the slow unraveling of the human body under stress. His journals, meticulous in detail, recorded the precise effects of each concoction, the timing of deterioration, and even the psychological reactions of his patients. In his eyes, He was a scientist in a kingdom of ignorance, a god wielding life and death as easily as a painter wields a brush. But the court, though slow to recognize the danger, began to stir. A few brave courtiers, noticing the growing pattern of mysterious deaths, exchanged secret warnings. A physician from another kingdom, visiting as part of an official delegation, commented on unusual treatment methods. Rumors began to creep into the palace halls, whispered in kitchens, corridors, and private chambers. Fear, which had once been his instrument, now became a mirror reflecting his crimes back onto him. The physician's fall was not sudden but inevitable. Each new experiment left traces, and each miscalculation made him more visible to those who had once admired him. An envoy survived a near-fatal dose, and suspicions grew. A noble witnessed symptoms that mirrored previous deaths, realizing the connection. Even the king, once blind in trust, began to notice inconsistencies in his physician's accounts. The very brilliance that had made the physician indispensable now became a liability, revealing patterns that could not be ignored indefinitely. One evening, during a banquet meant to celebrate a royal victory, the physician's carefully controlled environment began to collapse. Guests fell ill in rapid succession, and the timing of their symptoms drew attention. Servants whispered of the same treatments being administered, of the physician lingering a moment too long by certain bedsides. By midnight, fear had replaced celebration, and the first overt accusations began to circulate. The physician, once confident in his omnipotence, realized too late that his actions had drawn the eyes of those who were finally brave enough to observe, question, and connect the dots. In the shadows of the palace, alliances formed. Servants, courtiers, and rival physicians gathered evidence, documenting every suspicious death, every unexplained illness, and every deviation from standard treatment. The palace, once a stage for the physician's silent cruelty, was transforming into a tribunal of hidden witnesses and careful recorders. The tension was palpable. Each interaction, each glance, each whispered warning added to the sense that the physician's reign of terror could no longer remain concealed. Even as suspicion grew, the physician did not relent. He attempted to manipulate, charm, and deceive his accusers, offering explanations, feigning concern, and leveraging his reputation. Yet the court had changed. Fear had turned into vigilance, and respect had mutated into cautious observation. The physician, who had once ruled life and death with effortless precision, now faced the slow tightening of scrutiny that would soon leave him exposed. His reign of death, which had seemed unstoppable, now teetered on the brink of discovery. Every patient, every experiment, every subtle act of cruelty had contributed to his growing notoriety. The palace, filled with whispers and watchful eyes, became a labyrinth from which he could no longer escape. The tools that had granted him power, fear, charm, knowledge, were now the very instruments by which his deeds would be unveiled to a shocked and horrified court. And so, the stage was set for the final act: exposure, reckoning, and the ultimate consequences of a life spent turning healing into murder. The physician's brilliance, once his shield, would become his undoing, and the kingdom would finally see the terrifying truth behind the trusted hands that had caused so much suffering. The palace, once a theater of the physician's secret experiments, had become a web of suspicion and silent vigilance. Those who had once whispered in shadows now spoke openly among trusted allies, piecing together the physician's pattern of cruelty. Each patient's death, once dismissed as misfortune, was now understood as a thread in a larger, horrifying tapestry. The whispers of fear had transformed into murmurs of outrage, and the stage was set for a confrontation that no one could have predicted but everyone feared. The first step toward his exposure came from an unlikely source, a young apprentice who had observed more than his seniors. With courage fueled by conscience and horror, he documented every anomaly he had witnessed: the unexplained fevers, the precise timing of deaths, and the deliberate manipulations in treatments. This record, painstakingly detailed and preserved in secrecy, became the nucleus of the case against the physician. For months, the apprentice moved carefully, sharing evidence with a few trustworthy courtiers while avoiding the physician's ever-watchful eyes. The physician, though brilliant, was not infallible. His arrogance blinded him to the possibility that someone could piece together the clues he had left behind. He believed himself untouchable, as he always had, confident that skill and charm could deflect suspicion indefinitely. Yet the palace, once silent under his influence, now hummed with quiet observation. Courtiers watched his every move, noting inconsistencies and recording details. Even the king, who had placed absolute trust in him, began to notice the patterns too glaring to ignore. When confrontation came, it was sudden and dramatic. During a council meeting, a noble who had long harbored suspicions presented evidence to the king. Records of treatments, timelines of mysterious deaths, and testimonies from servants and attendants. The physician, initially dismissive, attempted to charm and deceive, spinning plausible explanations for each accusation. Yet the mounting evidence was undeniable. The meticulousness that had once made him untouchable now worked against him. Every carefully crafted lie unraveled under the scrutiny of collected facts. The king, horrified by the revelation, could scarcely believe the betrayal. The court too was stunned. Their trusted healer, once admired and revered, was revealed as a manipulator of life and orchestrator of countless deaths. Panic rippled through the palace, as nobles, servants, and physicians alike grappled with the reality that those in their care had suffered at the hands of the man sworn to protect them. Shock gave way to rage, and the royal physician, cornered, could no longer hide behind his veneer of benevolence. The trial that followed was both swift and dramatic. Witnesses recounted chilling observations, patients who had been manipulated to suffering, deaths that followed unnatural patterns, and the calculated cruelty behind what had been mistaken for care. Servants spoke of the subtle horrors they had seen, the quiet terror in the palace corridors, and the signs they had noticed long before the court understood the truth. Even those who had once admired him could not deny the overwhelming evidence of guilt. In court, the physician's demeanor shifted from arrogance to desperation. He attempted to justify his actions as experiments, claiming the pursuit of knowledge as his motive. But the kingdom, horrified by the scale and intent of his crimes, would not accept rationalizations. The distinction between science and murder had been obliterated, and the court delivered a verdict reflecting the severity of his betrayals. Justice, long delayed by fear and awe, was finally served. The execution, as much a spectacle as it was a punishment, became a symbol of the consequences of unchecked ambition and moral corruption. Crowds gathered to witness the fall of a man who had turned healing into a weapon, whose brilliance had been matched only by his cruelty. The palace, once a place where life and death were manipulated with impunity, was now a cautionary tale, a reminder that power without ethics leads inevitably to ruin. Yet the legacy of the royal physician extended beyond his death. His journals, once private records of horrifying experiments, were preserved first as evidence, then as a study of human behavior, morality, and the dangers of ambition unchecked by conscience. Scholars and physicians studied them, not for methods of manipulation, but as a stark lesson in ethical responsibility. The palace itself became haunted by memories of those who had suffered, a silent reminder of the thin line between genius and monstrosity. Families of victims who had once suffered quietly found recognition and closure, though the scars of loss remained. Courtiers and servants, now vigilant and wary, learned that blind trust, even in the most revered experts, could be fatal. The kingdom instituted reforms, stricter oversight of medical practitioners, accountability measures, and a culture of ethical responsibility that sought to prevent such horrors from occurring again. The physician's crimes became a reference point for generations, a dark chapter in the history of medicine and monarchy. Yet there remained a fascination, almost morbid, with the man who had wielded life and death as if they were tools for amusement. Writers chronicled his story, dramatists staged his crimes, and historians debated the psychology behind his actions. Some saw him as a symbol of ambition corrupted by curiosity, others as a warning of what occurs when morality is abandoned in pursuit of knowledge. In every retelling, the central truth remained. His brilliance had been inseparable from his cruelty, and the palace had never been the same after his shadow passed over it. The moral of the story, echoing through the ages, is stark and unyielding. Knowledge and skill, no matter how extraordinary, are hollow without conscience. Trust, once betrayed, leaves wounds that linger long after the guilty are punished. The palace, a microcosm of power and ambition, revealed that evil often wears the mask of virtue, and that vigilance, courage, and ethical responsibility are the only safeguards against it. And so, the tale of the royal physician concludes not with redemption, but with a grim reminder. Even the most trusted hands can harbor darkness, and the line between healer and murderer can be frighteningly thin. His life, his experiments, and his downfall are etched into history as a chilling testament to the dangers of unchecked ambition, the perversion of knowledge, and the silent terror that can thrive behind a mask of respectability. The story of the royal physician who killed for fun is not merely a tale of murder. It is a mirror reflecting human curiosity, ambition, and the moral choices that define our humanity. It reminds us that brilliance, when divorced from conscience, can become a weapon more dangerous than any poison, and that those who hold power over life and death must wield it with responsibility, humility, and an unwavering respect for the sanctity of human life. In the end, the palace returned to a semblance of order, but the shadow of his deeds lingered. Courtiers spoke in hushed tones, families remembered, and the lessons endured. The physician's story remains a dark legend, a narrative passed through generations as both warning and fascination. It is a story that captures the imagination and terrifies the conscience, a reminder that human cruelty can wear the mask of care, and that the most dangerous monsters may be found in the most trusted places. If you found this story as chilling and fascinating as it was, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more tales from history that reveal the dark side of human ambition. Dive deeper into the shadows of the past, and discover the stories that teach us the most about power, trust, and the human condition.